presentation. And last researcher, Yifat Gutman, gained her PhD in sociology in New York School for Social Research. And her problematics centered around the memory studies, the problem of transnational politics, ethics, and society. Probably you can start.
Okay. Thank you so much. I thank the organizers for a great conference and the presenters for a rich and important set of papers. I enjoyed reading them, and in my response I will address each one of the papers to draw similarities and differences, and also to raise larger issues, questions, and concerns regarding the relationships between civil society and transitional justice. One question or topic that will overarch my comments today is, what do civil society actions in Eastern and Central Europe teach us about the status of transitional justice today in general? In light of the internal struggles and different meanings attached to transitional justice in these three cases, I want to raise two possibilities among others. Is transitional justice and the tools to achieving it today are part of an internal project in these and other cases that often becomes a struggle on or search for a national identity, a new post-communist national identity between groups that hold different or even oppositional visions of this identity? Or is transitional justice today, in other cases, a globally circulating transnational platform which NGOs and political groups can use to translate their local struggles for redress into internationally legitimate and intelligible claims? In each of these possibilities, what does one gain from specifically calling or justifying one's claims as transitional justice? What do civil society groups achieve in reality using this term, and for whom? And what does this term replaces or overshadows that civil society has used before in political and social struggles? I will start with Nadia Nedlewski's elaborate and rigorous paper on the role of civil society in promoting transitional justice in post-World War II, post-communist Slovakia. Nadia's investigation begins, at least the original paper, begins with the important task of examining the basic terms, starting with what is civil society. Nedlewski's critical examination of the concept of civil society reveals the normative assumptions that often underlie it in scholarly research. In the Habermasian tradition that she examines, civil society is a wide range of free associations and agencies and groups that operate outside state channels and are engaged in deliberative democracy. They debate their claims in public. Their very existence and deliberation are linked in this tradition to the promotion of inclusion and tolerance in society, she writes. These normative assumptions that have been critiqued by several different groups of scholars, among them feminist scholars, are also rejected by Nedlewski's findings in the Slovak case and stands in the Romanian case. Both find that in reality the very existence of groups and associations that operate outside state channels does not guarantee that their motivations and interests would correspond to these liberal democratic values. In Romania, not all groups interested in transitional justice support reckoning. And in Slovakia, some of these groups exclude or call for exclusion on the basis of ethnicity, race, or gender. They also, in Slovakia, have contradictory approaches that accept and reject redress for victims of the regime in different cases, supporting compensation for political prisoners of the communist regime, but denying redress for victims of the state during the Nazi occupation. Another problematic assumption of the Habermasian autonomous from state and from economy public sphere, Nedlewski argues, is that the sphere consists of critical rational debate among civil society groups. These associations and groups debate and ultimately reach a consensus by convincing one another that the most reasonable argument or claim. As Nedelsky notes, this consensual mutual understanding, that is the goal of Habermas's critical rational public debate, has been criticized by various scholars, and if I may add, is also confronted, for example, by the concept of counter-publics, publics that are defined by conflict and tension with the larger and dominant public that Warner wrote about. And it, of course, reminds us that within civil society, not all publics or groups are equal. Indeed, what we see in Nedelsky's research in the Slovak case, as well as Stan's study of the Romanian case, is what we see as a constant struggle, not consensus, on the dominant perception of the national past between different rival groups who each hold a substantially different concept of the Slovak or Romanian national identity. It is important to note, moreover, that the expectation that all publics and spheres of publics around the world would have similar feature is Eurocentric. Habermas describes the historical emergence of an autonomous public sphere, a modern development in discursive gatherings and communication via the print media of bourgeois men in late 17th and 18th century Western and Central Europe. However, like modernity itself, the autonomous sphere has since spread in the continent and around the world, carrying with it not only new empirical realities, but also a range of normative position and practical political consequences. As Nedelsky argues, a variety of electronic and digital media, independent media, also have a central role in these spheres of publics. She also argues that independent media is a member of civil society and not just a medium for its debates, like print media in the Habermasian public sphere. Instead of the Habermasian universal and ideal civil society, which specific civil societies will always fail to follow, publics and civil society should be studied as a social problem, the problem of constituting a relatively autonomous and deliberative sphere of publics in particular cases. After examining the normative assumptions that underlie our perception of civil society, Nedelsky examines the assumptions that underlie transitional justice in the few studies of civil society in this regard. And she discovers that these assumptions often resemble the normative assumptions that underlie civil society. According to Becker, for example, I quote Nedelsky, "A strong civil society contribution to a supportive state will strengthen democracy." Will strengthen, or Becker's assumption is that that the contribution of a strong civil society and a supportive state will be, the contribution will be compatible with both transitional justice and democracy. So it's compatible. And this assumption, again, is confronted with her findings and Stan's and others that some of the groups who are engaged with transitional justice seek to promote undemocratic and intolerant goals. And so we're still left wondering what transitional justice really means. I would encourage us to continue this investigation because, of course, it has important consequences for our research. So we should ask, is transitional justice a normative, liberal-leaning political project that has been abused by groups with oppositional aims, non-liberal-leaning, or is it an extremely flexible term that can be used for a variety of claims that are not necessarily liberal, democratic, or viewing a coming to terms with the past, with the difficult past as a crucial step towards a better society in the future? And if indeed transitional justice is a liberal-leaning normative project, how should we study it? Is there an ideal transitional justice and an analytical transitional justice, like the division that Seligman makes regarding civil society in Nedelsky's piece? Lavinia Stan's important chapter studies civil society and transitional justice in Romania, a case that raises another set of difficulties in addition to the ones that I've already combined in Nedelsky's, in the comments for the first paper. So it raises another set of difficulties in advancing transitional justice through civil society. Primarily acting outside state channels, civil society is often very limited in shaping legal redress and official state recognition and compensation. This is especially evident when a state perpetrator's non-state victims dichotomy, as Stan calls it, exists during and after the transition to democracy. In Romania, Stan writes, this dichotomy, quote, has remained almost unchanged since 1989, end quote. It leads, as Stan observes, to a victim-concentrated civil society and to a competition between groups that call for redress for different atrocious pasts and their victims. Quote, their contradictory agendas, Stan maintains, have delegitimized transitional justice, instilled memory fatigue in the public, and provided arguments for governments to do as little as possible in coming to terms with the recent past. Post-conflict and post-transition states usually seeks to stress continuity and stability and affirm their rule rather than a radical structural transformation from the previous regime, no matter how socially and politically different or oppositional they appear. And this is evident even more when they do address the past publicly, for example, in the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission. This tendency towards continuation rather than a radical structural transformation that transitional justice sometimes calls for makes it difficult for victim groups to find a sincere ally in the state regarding substantial reckoning with the difficult past. Moreover, the origin of transitional justice, or some sort of basis in legal measures that are executed by the state or international agencies in some cases, requires legal expertise and connections with the state among civil society groups. And lack of legal expertise, then argues, led representatives of civil society in Romania to suggestions such as an all-encompassing trial of communism, a trial of the leftist ideology of communism. It's a quote. This call from 1990 by the Civic Alliance had little legal value in comparison to trials of specific cases and people, Stan notes, but it might have had or could maybe have in the future effect on the public debate and consciousness on the communist past. Indeed, when we look at transitional justice-oriented group achievements, they're often less concretely legal and more symbolic. Civil society groups in Slovakia have been successfully supporting the legal system in initiating and shaping public commemoration that gives symbolic recognition to former political prisoners. In Romania, civil society advocated the Presidential Commission for the Study of the Communist Dictatorship and a condemnation of the regime by the president, as well as commemoration. The media in both cases had a significant role in advancing the opening of files in Slovakia and calling attention to identifying secret agents in the mass media in Romania. So perhaps our expectation from civil society in this regard should be focused on symbolic recognition of the victims through commemoration and other forms, and more importantly on how such groups influence public debate by raising issues of coming to terms with the past or pasts. This is the most important aspect of what social movements and activist groups generally do, shaping people's views and desired outcomes through public debate. In such public debates, a variety of values and visions for society are raised by different groups, not equal again, of course, but not just liberal values who address, and these groups address each other and the state. While in the Romanian and Slovak case studies, transitional justice is a set of tools and practices for coming to terms with the past, the Russian case shows a shift in using transitional justice by civil society from a tool for claim-making about the past to protesting against present political problems. Elena Glushko examines the changing meaning assigned to one of transitional justice central tools, lustration in Russia, in social networks from 2005 to the present. Initially in 2005, lustration was used to mean, quote, the deprivation of rights for communists and their supporters, unquote. Soon after, it is focused on deprivation regarding holding public office and refers to, according to Glushko, quote, a purge and employment ban. Then this meaning is carried on for the next 2 years by both oppositional groups and government supporters who mock them. Although there is one blogger in 2007 that calls for that means incarceration. In addition, then the term gains a broader meaning. For example, calling the murder of a retired security general the Russian lustration, in quotes, by an opposition activist. And sometimes it is used out of the transitional justice context. Lists of candidates for lustration are being made, and since 2010, around Putin's statement of running for a third term, lustration is used to protest against his re-election and against other anti-democratic governmental actions in the present. There, it serves as a call to name and impeach politicians involved in anti-democratic legislation and human rights violation. Glushko offers two motives in the written paper, at least, I don't think in the presentation, but two motives behind the use of lustration for present problems by oppositional activists who have been forcibly, as we see in the picture, oppressed and prevented from using many other tools of public and judicial action. These motives are threatening the government, means to threaten the government, and self-assurance among activists that a political change will come. But I would be interested to know whether lustration is used by oppositional groups and protesters who gain momentum also with the growing lustration legislation in the region to appeal not only to internal public audiences or to the internal Russian publics, but also to external audiences and to the international arena. As means to turn their attention and call for their involvement in the Russian political arena. Like human rights, perhaps lustration and transitional justice in general became a globally circulating platform through which groups can translate their local and national struggles to appeal to broader audiences and call for their empathy and involvement in political arenas, maybe that limit acting with the state or internally. Finally, I want to raise some question for all three presenters, and I'll do it briefly. First, transitional justice has become such a widely used term in a relatively short period of time. Originally, it coined to discuss legal restitution, but now it includes various aspects: monetary and other material compensation, commemoration and historical commissions, peace education, reconciliation, economic development, also national identity construction, perhaps, or citizenship laws. So the question is, what is the price of this expansion, and what does the expansion of the term transitional justice replaces or overshadows? What has transitional justice replaced, or especially what would these groups see as their aims without it? I suspect that peace, education, and reconciliation may be central themes that civil society had promoted before, but are now called transitional justice. And I think that struggles over national identity have been, as I suggested, intermingled with or sometimes masked by transitional justice in civil society. Second, how much these efforts and calls for transitional justice by civil society been influenced by, learned from, and or adopted, imported from neighboring post-communist countries. All three papers mention regional and international influences and momentums. I won't list them due to the lack of time. What about influences or pressure from global or EU paradigms, initiatives, or funders? It's also, there's a funding system to NGOs. How popular are efforts to bypass the state through appeals to the European Union Commission, for example, such as in the case of the Greek Church in Romania? Are they usually explored by institutions that have already or that are transcending the nation state, like churches? and how much have these groups been funded or supported by the EU, and to what extent has that influenced their external or internal oriented transitional justice efforts. And then finally, maybe I have more questions, but I'll keep them, I'll ask you later, but finally, research on the expansion and institutionalization of NGOs in the 90s in Israel, Palestine, Latin America, and other parts of the world observed an NGOization process that is connected to the strengthening of neoliberal trends, privatization, and the retreat of the welfare state, and characterized by depolitization. Has the engagement of civil society groups with transitional justice been related to a similar process and shows a tendency of depoliticizing, or does it rather, I think maybe as we see in the papers, assist in further escalation and polarization in society? And finally, just addressing the multiple past, the Holocaust and the communist regime, as well as different revolts and violent campaigns of the former regime, leads to a competition between victim groups in Stan's case and a contradictory approach to redressing Nedelsky's. As Michael Rothberg talks about a multidirectional memory of past atrocities, I wonder, instead of a competition, I wonder if there could be a multidirectional way to advance transitional justice instead of a zero-sum game construction of claims and groups and victim groups. I'm especially interested in how the state and civil society could promote that. I'm really finishing, how the state may contribute to such multidirectionality instead of being able to not act at all as a result of the competition and struggle within civil society. Thank you so much.